Okay, hey guys. We're going to go through a bunch of slides today. We've got a lot of vocab to cover, so it's a lot of terms, but we're going to be talking about communities and ecosystems. So stay tuned. It's going to be a little bit long. If you need to pause in the middle, that's fine. But here we go. All right, I'm going to pull up the slides for today, and please follow along in your notes. Let's see if you can see what I'm doing. All right, so here are my slides. And we're going to present this to everyone. All right, that looks a little crazy. This should be better. Okay, so here we go. Our significant ideas for this video. So the species interacts with its abiotic and biotic environments, and its niche or niche is described by these interactions. Populations change and respond to interactions with the environment, and any system has a carrying capacity for a given species. So this is the definition of species that we'll be working with. Now, there are other alternate definitions of species depending on who you're talking to, what kind of biologist you're working with. But for our purposes, we're going to use this simple definition, and a group of organisms that interbreed and produce fertile offspring will be called a species for us. So these are examples of different species of moth in front of us, or moths. A habitat is the environment in which a species normally lives. So a lot of moths live in like swampy areas, so this would be their habitat. A population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area at the same time and which are capable of interbreeding. So, for example, all of these bees together, or hornets it looks like, would be together a population of insects. A community is a group of populations living and interacting with each other in a common habitat. Now, generally, when we talk about a community, we're only talking about the biotic factors, so all the living things together. We'll talk about abiotic factors in just a second. Oops. Okay, again, a niche or a niche, depending on how you pronounce it, is the particular set of abiotic and biotic conditions and resources to which an organism or population responds. An alternate way of saying that is the role a species is going to fill within its community or ecosystem. So we want to talk about fundamental versus realized niche. So the part of the habitat in which a species can live in the absence of competitors and predators is called its fundamental niche. In reality, it's going to be interacting with a lot of different organisms, so the part it actually occupies is its realized niche, meaning when you talk about like realizing your dream, for example, you are actually doing that dream, you're doing those actions. So this is what the species is actually doing. It may be capable of filling different roles or occupying different parts of a habitat. However, what it's actually doing is its realized niche. We have different types of species that can do different things. Generalist species have really wide niches and they can adapt well to change. So when humans come along, for example, a raccoon is able to scavenge in trash cans and can adapt that way. Specialist species, however, have very narrow niches and they don't adapt well to change. And these are the kind of species we see going extinct first when there's habitat loss, when there's a large environmental change, and sometimes these species can even be keystone species, which is dangerous. We'll talk about those in a second as well. So again, some species are just a little bit more hardy than others. When we have an overlap of two different organisms, or more than two, in their niche, that's when we start to have our types of competition. We'll go further into competition later, but I want to let you know that when two species are trying to fill the same role in a community or ecosystem, that is when they have to compete for resources or for habitat, or in this case, for light. When we talk about our abiotic and our biotic factors, a simple way to think of it is our living and our non-living factors. And I said that backwards in the order of the titles. So A means not or without, and biotic, bio, you can think living. So abiotic would mean our non-living factors in an ecosystem, and our biotic factors are our living things. So for example, our biotic factors here would be all of our different species of weeds and grass, our species of trees and shrubs here, and any little small organisms like, I don't know, a little gopher or something that's hiding in the grass. So, and oops, any insects. I'm going too fast. Go back. Our abiotic factors would be things like minerals within the soil. It would be temperature. It would be the sunlight, the climate. It would be, the terrain, the rocks. So things that are going to influence the species and the organisms within that ecosystem. However, they are not living factors. Ecological gradients are gradual change in abiotic factors through time or space. They determine the geographic location of where a species can live or their habitat. And so we can see different ecological gradients within this sort of mountain diagram here. So let me talk about keystone species very quickly. Now we have foundational species, which are going to be our species that are important and they benefit other species within an ecosystem. Keystone species, though, and this is in reference to an arch. We have our keystone here at the top of our arch. Without that keystone, if you remove that, the entire arch would crumble. It would fail to be supported. So that keystone species is very similar to that in that it's very, very essential to the ecosystem. And if you removed it, it would have a drastic change on the rest of the organisms within that ecosystem. So keystone roles have a large effect on the types and abundance of other species in ecosystems. So depending on the ecosystem, we can have several different types of keystone species, but keystone species, just you need to remember, are very, very important, and without them, if they were removed or if their population changes, that's going to have drastic, so really large effects on other species in the ecosystem. So these are some diagrams and examples of keystone species in different environments. Here is another example of the arch thing. Now, the beaver doesn't actually live in the arch, but the beaver does have effects on eagles and bears and birds and mice and humans and insect or crayfish, whatever that is, the diagram. So if these beavers were removed from the ecosystem, all these other organisms would be affected and would have drastic changes. Here we have a diagram of an experiment that was done with sea stars. When the sea star Pisaster was removed from the community experimentally, the number of species dropped from 18 to 1. So this is a different species, and when the sea star removed, the mussels showed a huge drop over the course of the next few years, and they didn't recover after the sea star was removed. When the sea star wasn't removed, though, the mussels had a gradual incline. It looks like a steady population increase, which is normal. So let's talk about survivorship curves. Now we're looking at graphs. We got to practice our graph reading skills. There's 3 general types of survivorship curves that we will look at. Type 1 is going to be high survivorship in early and middle ages. So species tend to survive pretty well when they're young and middle age. And then low survivorship in old age. So we'll see this decline here once the species becomes old. Our type 2 survivorship curve will have steady survivorship, so constant mortality rate regardless of age. It just sort of like drops throughout the entire spectrum of age for our species. In type 3, we have a high mortality rate early in life, and it kind of levels out as our species grow older. So we're going to talk about different types of species and then compare them to these survivorship curves in just a second. We have what we call R-selected species. Now, our characteristics of our R-selected species is that they're small in size. They're more of our generalist. They can adapt pretty well to change because they can maybe fill a number of niches. They have a low ability to compete. Their population growth is going to be a high population growth rate, but it'll fluctuate. And they can either live in unstable environmental conditions, and they're generally early successional. So they'll be some of the first organisms to occupy a space after a disturbance. As far as their offspring goes, they'll have a lot of offspring. There'll be very little parental care or investment in those offspring because there are so many, they can afford to lose a few evolutionarily. And they'll have an early reproductive age. So the species will mature quickly so they can reproduce more. And you can see the goal of this R-selected species is just to produce as many as possible because it's, most of them are going to actually die before reproducing. And we're going to see this represented as a type 3 survivorship curve. So some examples are certain insects like cockroaches, mice, and certain plants like weeds like dandelions. Our K-selected species are different types of organisms. Now, these are generally larger. They're generally specialists, so they respond less well to change. They have a very specialist niche in an environment. They have a low population growth rate, and their size is fairly stable. They're not going to fluctuate as much. They'll generally live in stable environments, and they'll be a late successional species. So they'll arrive in an environment after there's been a lot of growth and a lot of development. They'll have fewer but larger offspring. There's a lot of parental care and investment in those offspring because there are fewer of them. They want to make sure they survive to continue to pass on those genes. They will have a later reproductive age, so the organisms will go to maturity before they actually are able to, later maturity before they're able to reproduce. And most offspring are going to be able to live to reproductive age. And we'll see this represented in a type 1 survivorship curve. Now we're going to talk about our J curves as well, which shows a population that's increasing exponentially, meaning it continues to go up and up and up and up to a certain exponent. And we will see it's increasing and increasing rates. Our S curve is going to show a population that was increasing exponentially. You see the first part of this S is actually a J curve, but then it levels off. And what causes the leveling off is called carrying capacity. So what is carrying capacity? It's the maximum population of a given species that a particular habitat can sustain indefinitely without degrading the habitat. So there is always limits on this exponential population growth. So a population may grow and grow and grow and grow and grow if it's healthy and it has the resources it needs, but finally there is generally going to be some one or many limiting resources or limiting factors that are going to basically cause this population to level off at a certain point. And there it is. So as a population levels off, it's going to fluctuate slightly above and below the carrying capacity, and that's what we see in real life. So obviously not every population will show a perfect curve that's going to line up with our carrying capacity limit. It'll actually go up and down. Populations grow rapidly with lots of resources, but as resources become limited, our growth rate is going to slow and level off. So people sometimes ask, like, what about us? Can we increase our Earth's carrying capacity? Sometimes we can if you develop adaptations as a species. Remember, individuals cannot adapt. However, populations adapt. Groups of organisms do, and we'll talk about that later as well. Some can migrate, so they can change their carrying capacity that way. And we've invented a lot of technology that's been able to extend the carrying capacity for humans. And a lot of scientists disagree about what the actual carrying capacity of the Earth is for the human population. Some scientists think that we are about to hit it. Others think that we are going to continue to increase our population due to the fact that we have technology and innovations that can help us continue to grow without reaching that point where we don't have enough resources for everyone. So let's look again at our R-selected and K-selected species and carrying capacity. So lots of R-selected species die before pressures from carrying capacity hit. So they would die around this point, but lots of K-selected species die as pressures from carrying capacity hit. So we're going to see more effects of carrying capacity on our K-selected species. Remember, these are the species that, let's get back to that slide. There we go, are larger, they're specialists, and they have generally a low population growth rate and fewer and larger offspring. So we will see them be more affected by our carrying capacity and limiting factors. Okay, so our survivorship curves tell us how long a certain species typically live. Lots of K-selected species die late in their lives. We see that drop off here. Lots of R-selected species die early in their lives. And some species just die at a constant rate, and we see our constant loss with our type 2 curve right here. All right, we just went through a ton of information. So let me pull back. Woo, that looks crazy. Okay. Hopefully you can see me again. Hopefully that worked really well. I just went through a lot of stuff very quickly. Please go back and watch the video again and follow up on your notes. All right, I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.